So I'm in the second part of this Distributist classic, G.K. Chesterton's The Outline of Sanity. And it's in the second part of this book that he, for the first time, as far as I can tell, mentions Christianity and how it fits into his vision for distributism. And it comes in a chapter where he makes a very modest proposal that he nevertheless thinks could start something. I think he's of the opinion that the old a single spark could start a prairie fire. Even a little bit of pushback against big business could open up some sort of space for smaller property to return. And in this case, it's a proposal for creating a sort of mandatory holiday that all businesses would have to close or not allow. They wouldn't be able to require their workers to work for a half a day once a week. And we know now that, the larger the business, the easier it is for them to stay open 24/7. People are working in the middle of the night at, Kroger grocery stores and Walmart and places like that, and all sorts of places. And basically he says that, this would be a boon for small business, because one of the pressures on smaller businesses is that once these big stores take over, they can't close, because during that day that they're closed, in which they could rest up or do their inventory or whatever, the other business, the large competitor, will not. So this would kind of more than even the playing field. In fact, he says the smaller proprietor who can run his shop on his own and not require his workers to be there could actually stay open during that time, and therefore create this kind of niche where he could enter the market and make people realize he's there. So anyway, Chesterton brings in Christianity here on page 105. Like I said, as far as I can tell, the first time explicitly mentioning it. He says, "Now when you have got your considerable sprinkling of small proprietors, of men with the psychology and philosophy of small property, then you can begin to talk to them about something more than just a general settlement upon their own lines, something more like a land fit for Christians to live in. You can make them understand, as you could not make plutocrats or proletarians understand, why the machine must not exist save as the servant of the man," instead of the other way around, of course, "why the things we produce ourselves are precious like our own children, and why we can pay too dearly for the possession of luxury by the loss of liberty." Okay? And to use the example he started that chapter out with, the luxury of 24/7 everything, does equate or does translate into a certain loss of liberty, namely the loss of an awful lot of property over the decades that used to be the basis for some more independent citizenship. Okay? And that's a part of his point. Now, he also mentioned this in this chapter, a sort of anarchist idea, which is that, it's not pure anarchism, but it's, the idea that if there were enough of these small proprietors in any particular place, they could actually form a sort of cooperative with each other of some sort. He calls it a guild. I might say, use your imagination and think if the Chamber of Commerce had committees, right? You have the barbers committee, and you have the grocery committee, and the farming committee, and the people who work in those businesses and trades could be a part of those committees, and they would on their own set any sort of rules and regulations to create fair competition amongst them, with the idea of not driving some out of business and making others bigger, but sort of coexistence. That is a kind of anarchist thought, because it is basically saying, he says explicitly that it would be better for them to govern themselves than to be governed, because Chesterton makes the point repeatedly in this book that government is really what has allowed monopoly in the first place. It has allowed the concentration of capital into fewer and fewer hands, into corporate hands. And has allowed the confiscation or competing away of a lot of small property. At the end of this chapter, he says, perhaps we have some reason to doubt whether our souls and bodies are not at least as safe in the hands of a guild as they are likely to be in the hands of a trust, a monopoly, or I would say a large corporate presence, right? For the moment, the main point is that small shops can be governed even if they are not bossed by the government. Horrible as this may seem to the democratic idealists of the day, they can be governed by themselves. So that's interesting. And then in the next chapter, which is entitled The Tyranny of the Trusts, he takes on a particular personality. You might say it's a stereotype of a certain type of naysayer. He characterizes it as a sort of old gentleman, okay? He says he is the sort of man who has a horror of socialists without any very definite idea of what they are. And he says that he would probably be right thinking if he ever thought. You know, Chesterton is, he's got a very dry wit, but you learn to appreciate it. He says this old gentleman who is horrified by socialism, his principles would probably be sound enough if they were really applied. It is his practical ignorance that prevents him from knowing the world to which they are applicable. He might really be right, only he has no notion of what is wrong. Those who have sat under this old gentleman know that he is in the habit of softening his stern repudiation of the mysterious socialists by saying that of course it is a Christian duty to use our wealth well, to remember that property is a trust committed to us by Providence for the good of others as well as ourselves, and even that it is just possible that we may someday be asked a question or two about the abuse of such trust someday when we go to the pearly gates. In other words, did you use your property for the benefit of everybody, or did you just use it selfishly for yourself? I think that's what he's referring to. So what he's saying here is this old gentleman, this is just a character that he's imagining in his head, who represent a great deal of the naysayers against both socialism and distributism, okay, are, the type of person who wants to focus so much on socialism that they never seriously ask the question, what's wrong with capitalism, okay? And also, they are the sort of person who sort of imagines that a previous type of property ownership still exists. So they imagine in their world there are still lots of property owners. For instance, you might say a lot of Americans these days own their homes. But as I think I mentioned last time, if you actually check to see how many of them own them, as in they don't have a mortgage and they're secure enough to pay their taxes, that's a much smaller number of people. But in the world of the gentleman, there's a lot of property owners, there's a lot of, small business people. But in reality, small business is dwindling. It's having to, if it wants to survive, cooperate with companies like Amazon and Google just to sell stuff online and stuff like that. But an awful lot of small businesses have gone under, and the COVID pandemic has really maybe put the last nail in the coffin of small business unless something is done. One of the things that Chesterton just beats like a dead horse practically, whatever, I'm not sure what the what that metaphor is, but you know what I'm saying. Like, he keeps hammering away at this idea that if you think that it's not possible to push back, if you live in this dreamland where there still is private property and real competition, or if you think that yes, things have changed, but we have to just accept it because it's an inevitable, the train is running down the tracks and we can't stop it, then you are a part of the problem, and you have not got enough imagination, and in fact you are committing an error. You're committing a sort of moral error. And again, now here he doesn't mention Christianity specifically, but it's very, very It's very much here. He mentions the catechism. I don't know what the penny catechism is, but I bet it's a little catechism of the Catholic Church at that time. Not sure. So he says, I would sum up my general suggestions so far by saying that the chief danger to be avoided now, and the first danger to be considered now, is the danger of supposing the capitalist conquest more complete than it is. Now, this was in the 1920s. 1926 was when this was published. We've gone through trust busting. I would say we're all the way back to, the type of situation that he foresaw back then, and way more so, of course. It's different, but yet similar, okay? He says, if I may use the terms of the Penny Catechism about the two sins against hope, the peril now is no longer the peril of presumption, the sin of presumption, but rather of despair, the sin of despair. And this is not the first time he's used the term despair. Despair means having given up, having the idea that it is inevitable and therefore that you can't do anything about it. And this is wrong because then you have said, I will not do anything about it. And of course, people are supposed to be responsible for the world in which they live according to the Christian teaching, right? In a sort of very general way. I think I'm saying anything controversial. Christians probably shouldn't also be total determinists. I know Calvinism. But the other character that he mentions in this chapter on the tyranny of the trusts is the poor old clergyman. And so here again is another reference and a sort of critique of Christianity going on here, or at least the church of his day, I should say. This poor old clergyman apparently at some point in the past said, trust could never happen, or we don't need to worry about, too much economic monopolization and malfeasance. And then when trusts happen, when what we would call monopoly or big corporate power happen, then the clergyman acted as though it had always been the case and that it was inevitable. And therefore, the implication is committed the sin of despair, okay? By just basically talking as though it's inevitable, or even worse, and pretty frequent, ignoring the whole issue entirely, right? So he says of this poor clergyman that he is now really driven to talk as if a trust with a big T were something that had been bestowed on him by providence, that is, by God, providence with a capital P. He is driven to abandon all that he originally meant by his own curious sort of Christian individualism, and hastily reconciled himself to something that is more like a sort of plutocratic collectivism. And that's another theme of this book, and something that very rarely gets thought about, but Chesterton, some of these ideas are very fresh, at least for us. Corporate power is collectivizing. It's collectivizing in the name of profit for shareholders and for, CEOs, but it's a collectivized form of labor, and it takes a lot of freedom away from all the individuals involved in the process. And so, this is what he's driving at here. Pastor, you say that you're for the individual, right? And for individual responsibility. But whenever we corporatize, it's a type of bureaucratization. And whenever you do that, there is a loss of individuality and there is a loss of responsibility. The responsibility is diffused. And so he's saying to the poor old clergyman, hey, haven't you noticed that? And it doesn't comport with your stated principles. How is it that this is not a theme of resistance for you? Why is it that you act as though this is totally normal and acceptable? So here we have in this chapter criticism of the conservative types of his day, the anti-socialist, the sort of pious Christian, the gentleman, the pastor, who are so focused on other things that they don't see the world changing around them, and have therefore abdicated their responsibility to push back and to assert the free will that human beings do have to change their situation. Chesterton really doesn't want people to give up. He wants to emphasize the power of the political still. A lot of us today have given up on the political, and so there's more and more acting out as a sort of last-ditch attempt to get the political system to work for people again. But what about the political process, and what about reorienting so that the political process works for people? This is what he's calling for. Whether it can happen, I don't know, but I do think that if you read Chesterton, his hope is infectious. So, I'll see you next time.